Decorated horse trainer. The most decorated horse trainer in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's history had been missing for 11 years. Nobody was looking for him anymore. That was the point. Corporal Diane Firth had been working with Ghost for 6 weeks, and she was out of ideas. The mare, a silver-gray Canadian warmblood, worth more than most people's houses, Asian fields, acquired at considerable expense from a breeder in Quebec for the musical ride's upcoming centennial performance, had not taken a single step in formation. She stood in the training paddock at the RCMP's equestrian facility outside Rockcliffe, Ottawa, and she simply refused. Not with aggression, not with bucking or biting. She refused the way a wall refuses. She was just there, immovable, her dark eyes scanning the middle distance for something that wasn't in that paddock and never had been. Firth was good at her job. Everyone said so. She had placed top of her class at Depot, had trained under 3 senior ride masters, and had a gift for difficult animals that her supervisors described in performance reviews with words like intuitive and exceptional euphemas. She was 29 years old, and she had never once failed to bring a horse into compliance within a month. 6 weeks with Ghost felt like a personal indictment. Fields, the superintendent, had started coming by in the mornings. He didn't say anything. He just leaned on the fence rail with his coffee and watched, and that was somehow worse than if he'd said something. On a Tuesday in late October, with the first real cold of the season coming down from the shield and the paddock fence casting long shadows across the frost-stiffened ground, Firth was running Ghost through a basic walk-halt-walk sequence for the 40th time. The mare walked. The mare halted the moment Firth asked for any movement that involved another horse coming alongside her. Any movement that required Ghost to be part of something larger than herself. She stopped. The ears went flat as the muscles along her neck knotted up like rope. And she was gone somewhere else inside her own head, unreachable. "She's not disobedient," said a voice from the fence line. Firth turned. There was a man leaning against the cedar rail at the far corner of the paddock, near the equipment shed. Hadn't heard him approach. He was old. Mid-60s at least, maybe older. The kind of age that had settled into the bones rather than just the face. He wore canvas work pants and a heavyweight flannel shirt the color of spruce bark, and he had a thermos tucked under one arm. His hair was white and cut close. His face was deeply lined. It's quiet, not in the soft way of someone who'd spent decades at a desk, but in the particular way of a man who'd spent a great deal of time outside in serious weather. Measure pale, thin scars on the left side of his jaw that disappeared into his collar. Firth recognized him the way you recognize someone you've only ever seen from a distance. He was the man who kept the facility's water systems running. He'd shown up about 8 months ago, with references from a contractor in Arnprior and a manner that discouraged questions. The staff called him Connolly. Just Connolly. "Excuse me?" Firth said. "Disobedient," he said again, nodding toward Ghost. "She's waiting for something. With respect, sir, this isn't really a good time. She keeps looking at the gate." He tilted his head slightly. "Not trying to get through it, just looking, like she expects someone to come through it." Firth looked at Ghost. The mare was, in fact, looking at the gate. Been looking at the gate for 6 weeks. And Firth had logged it in her training notes as an evasion behavior, a focus problem, a displacement activity. She had never asked herself what Ghost thought was on the other side of it. "Do you know horses?" Firth asked, despite herself. Connolly took a slow sip from his thermos. "Sure, some." The superintendent appeared at the main fence then, saw Connolly at the corner rail, and went very still in a way that Firth noticed without being able to explain. He didn't call out, didn't wave the old man away from the restricted paddock area. He just watched. Connolly set his thermos on the fence post and stepped through the rail into the paddock. Firth moved forward instinctively. "You can't." Ghost's head came up, not in alarm, in attention, focused, electric attention. Her ears swiveled forward and locked. Her nostrils flared wide and her whole body went from the taut, turned inward stillness of an animal in distress to something else entirely. A pointing stillness, the stillness of recognition trying to catch up to itself. Connolly walked toward her the way you'd walk toward a fire you didn't want to disturb. No performance in it, outstretched hand, no clucking sounds, no deliberate softening of his posture to signal harmlessness. He just walked. Steady and unhurried, his boots quiet on the frozen ground, and he let the distance close on its own terms. Ghost took one step toward him, then another, and then she made a sound that Firth had never heard from her. A low, vibrating nicker that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the chest. Almost too low to be a horse sound, a field's. Almost like a question being asked in a language Firth didn't speak. The mare stretched her neck forward and pressed her nose against the old man's chest and held it there. Just held it there, umpernind, breathing him in while her sides shook with the effort of standing still. Connolly put one hand on the side of her face, didn't say anything for a long moment. When he did speak, his voice was too low for Firth to catch the words. It wasn't a command. It was the tone of voice you use in a hospital room, or at a graveside, when there's nothing useful left to say and the only honest thing is to let someone know you're there. Ghost's head dropped. The long line of tension that had lived in her neck and shoulders for 6 weeks, that Firth had massaged and stretched and tried to train around and eventually accepted as structural, simply released. The mare exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and then she leaned her full weight into the old man's hand and closed her eyes. The paddock was completely silent. Firth became aware that her own mouth was open. Danger. Behind her, she heard the superintendent set his coffee cup down on the fence rail very carefully, as though any noise might break something that couldn't be repaired. It took Connolly another 10 minutes to be persuaded to step out of the paddock and have a conversation. Even then, Ghost followed him to the fence line and stood with her chin on the top rail, watching him the way a dog watches its person leave for work. The superintendent's name was Chief Superintendent Alan Marsh, and he had been running the Rockcliffe facility for 4 years. He was a careful man, in the way that people who've survived long careers in organizations built on hierarchy and procedure tend to be careful. He did not rattle easily. He was rattled now. Spitty precision. How do you know this animal? He asked Connolly, in the careful neutral tone of someone asking a question they're not entirely sure they want answered. Looked back at Ghost, who was still watching him from the fence. I don't know her, he said. I know where she came from, the breeder in Quebec before that. He was quiet for a moment. It was a stallion. Out of a program that doesn't exist on paper anymore. He was bred specifically for high-stress operational environments. Search and rescue, remote territory work, the kind of conditions where you need an animal that will stay calm when a person is not. Exceptional genetics, exceptional temperament. He paused. Ghost is his daughter. I'd know that movement pattern anywhere. Marsh looked at him for a long time. What program? Connolly picked up his thermos from the fence post. One that doesn't exist on paper anymore, he said again pleasantly, in the tone of a man closing a door. Marsh was not the kind of superintendent who let doors close on him easily. He went back to his office and started making calls. Not the routine kind, say, where you use a different phone and you speak carefully and you wait. The file on Connolly, on the man who fixed water systems and kept to himself and had shown up 8 months ago with references from Arnprior, was not where it should have been. There was a file technically. It existed, action, but the core of it, the part that should have contained service history, the part that would have explained the scars on his jaw, and the way he moved through a space like a man who'd spent decades cataloging exits, was gone. Not redacted, auf dusty U-fields. Not classified in the usual way where you could at least see the shape of what had been removed. Just absent. Like something had been carefully lifted out and the edges pressed back together. Dusty fields. What Marsh did find, after 2 days of increasingly uncomfortable conversations with people who seemed surprised to be hearing the name, was a unit designation that no longer existed, attached to a period of service that officially ended with a medical discharge 15 years ago, attached to a commendation that had no citation, no date, and no signature he recognized. There was a photograph, very small, taken in what looked like northern terrain, taiga, maybe, or the kind of country that exists above the tree line in the territories. A man in the photo, younger, face harder, wearing gear that didn't have insignia. Beside him was a horse. Gray, almost white, with the same deep chest and particular way of holding the head that Ghost had. Marsh sat with that photograph for a long time, judges claim outs. He drove out to where Connolly was working the next morning. A pump house at the edge of the property, replacing a section of pipe that had given out in the first freeze. Connolly heard the vehicle and didn't look up from what he was doing. "I was told to stop asking questions," Marsh said. Connolly kept working. "Sounds like good advice. I'm not good at taking it." Marsh leaned against the pump house wall. "I found a photograph." Connolly's hands didn't stop moving. "A lot of photographs in the world. Not many of that particular terrain with that particular horse." Marsh paused. That was Ghost's father. The work stopped, not dramatically. Own dusty fieldsiever. Connolly set the pipe section down on the ground and straightened up slowly, and looked out across the facility grounds toward the paddock, where Ghost was visible in the middle distance in the thin October sunlight. "His name was Aspen," Connolly said after a moment. "Together for 4 years. The program was Northern sovereignty work. Sovereignty and some other things that aren't worth discussing, as remote areas where machines weren't practical and noise discipline was critical. He was quiet for a beat. Horses are quieter than you'd think, if they trust you. If they're trained right. Aspen was the best I ever worked with. Steady in conditions that would have broken most animals. Steady because he knew me. As we knew each other, what happened?" Connolly looked down at his hands. They were rough, capable hands, the knuckles enlarged with old injuries. "We were in the field. Northern Quebec, a long way from anywhere. There was an incident. The details are still classified. And I mean that literally, not as a deflection, and we both took damage. I was evacuated. Aspen was recovered separately." He stopped. "I was told he died of his injuries." Marsh understood then what he was looking at, a shape of it as any story where an institution finds it simpler to end things cleanly on paper than to manage the complications of the truth. "He didn't die," Marsh said. "No." Connolly's voice was even. "He lived. He was retired to a breeding program. And then, apparently, his daughter ended up here." He looked at Ghost again. "She has his eyes. She has his way of scanning, the way she watches the gate. Aspen used to do that. Always facing the direction we'd come from, like he was keeping track of the route home." Marsh thought about 6 weeks of training logs, 6 weeks of a gifted corporal trying every technique she knew on an animal that was physically perfect and psychologically absent. "She's not broken," Marsh said slowly. "No," Connolly agreed. "Yes, she's just never had a reason to be here. Aspen, horses like this, like Aspen, like her, they're not built for performance. They're built for partnership. Specific partnership. One person, one purpose. Sustained trust over time. In a program where the relationship is secondary to the outcome, and they..." He paused, looking for the word. "They wait, go somewhere inside themselves, and they wait for something that makes sense." Marsh looked at him. "Responded to you." Responded to the scent of her father's bloodline, recognizing something familiar. Connolly shook his head slightly. And maybe to something else. The same quality of, I don't know how to explain it. The same quality of attention. The way you stand with an animal like that. It either comes from experience, or it doesn't come at all. Marsh did next was not strictly within his authority, as he knew that. And he made the decision anyway, in the deliberate way that people make decisions they've already made, and are simply catching up to. He went back to his office, and he made one more call. Hart. This one to a retired general he'd served under 20 years ago, a man whose opinion he trusted more than any active file, and he described the situation with the precise brevity of someone who'd learned to communicate in institutions. The general was quiet for a moment when Marsh finished. Asking me, the general said. I'm asking whether the file I found tells the whole story. No file tells the whole story, the general said. That's not what files are for. Another pause. I'll tell you this. The man you're describing, if it's who I think it is, spent 15 years doing things that most people in this country will never know needed doing. And he asked for nothing. Not accommodation, not even acknowledgement. He asked to be left alone, and we gave him that much at least. A pause that felt weighted with something. If he's found his way to a place where he wants to be useful, that seems like something worth respecting. Marsh hung up and sat in his quiet office and thought about a mayor who stood at a paddock fence and watched the gate for 6 weeks, an old man with scarred hands who walked into a paddock and made sense of what every expert had failed to reach. As he walked back down to the pump house. Connolly had finished replacing the pipe and was cleaning his tools, laying them in order on a piece of canvas with the same care that Marsh had noticed from the beginning and hadn't known how to account for. There's a position here, Marsh said, not water systems, cleaning the tools. I'm good at water systems. I know you are. There's a position working with the animals, specifically with Ghost. Initially, potentially with the program more broadly. Training, methodology, the things you know that aren't in any manual. Connolly set down the wrench he was holding. He didn't answer immediately, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, exactly, but it had weight. I've been out of it a long time, he said finally. Whisper. You walked into that paddock yesterday and did in 3 minutes what 6 weeks of professional training hadn't managed. That's not, he stopped. Started again, not replicable through instruction. That's not a technique you can teach in a clinic. No, Marsh said. But the thinking behind it is. The way of seeing what an animal actually is instead of what you need it to be. The patience. The understanding that some things take the time they take. He paused. The young people coming into this program are good. They're technically excellent. There's something they're missing. And I think you know what it is. Connolly looked out at Ghost. Who had moved to the near fence line and was standing with her head up, facing their direction. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that a pair of Canada geese came in low over the property and landed noisily in the field beyond the tree line, and the horses in the far paddock moved and resettled. Does need consistent handling, Connolly said finally. Not a rotation of people, primary relationship, built slowly, with me present initially as a bridge. It won't work if it's treated as a performance metric. I'll write it into the program plan, Marsh said. Another silence. She really does have his eyes. Marsh said nothing. He used to make that same sound, Connolly said. That low sound. When he knew we were going somewhere difficult, it was telling me he understood. He exhaled slowly. I grieved that animal for 15 years, a long time to carry something. Marsh thought about the photograph, about the commendation with no citation, about a unit designation that didn't exist anymore. Yes, he said, it is, sure. The following week, On a gray November morning, with the first real snow coming down soft and steady over the greenbelt, Corporal Firth arrived at the paddock to find Connolly already there, at Ghost's shoulder, not doing anything in particular, just standing. His head was low, relaxed, her lower lip soft. She looked like a different horse. She looked, Firth thought, an animal that had finally arrived somewhere after a very long journey, and decided it could stop watching for what might come through the gate. Marsh was at the fence with 2 coffees, handed one to Firth without explanation. "Watch," he said. Connolly spoke something quietly to Ghost. A word, maybe 2, and then he moved forward. And Ghost moved with him, behind him, not in response to pressure or command. Beside him, matched to his pace, her shoulder at his shoulder, the 2 of them moving across the frost-pale paddock, with the easy coherence of things that have always belonged together. Firth watched and didn't say anything for a while. "Who is he?" she said finally. Just Marsh wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The snow came down soft and straight in the still air. "Someone who earned the right to be here," he said, in the months that followed. Connolly worked with Ghost every morning, before the rest of the facility came fully to life. He worked with Firth in the afternoons, dusty fields, teaching her things that weren't in the curriculum, that couldn't be graded or evaluated, that existed somewhere in the space between knowledge and instinct. How to read the muscles along the top line before they telegraphed an intention. How to make yourself a fixed point that an animal could orient by. XV fields. How to understand that partnership wasn't something you achieved and then possessed, but something you maintained daily through attention and honesty and a willingness to be changed by the relationship yourself. Ghost came into formation for the first time on a Tuesday in January in a light snowfall, alongside 2 other horses in the basic musical ride pattern. She wasn't perfect. She drifted slightly on the turn, yet her ears were forward, and her eye was bright, and she stayed present, inside the moment, inside the collective rhythm of the thing, and didn't drift away to look at the gate of she fence. Connolly watched from outside the fence. He had his thermos. When Firth brought Ghost out at the end of the session, the mare walked directly to the old man at the fence and put her head against his chest, up she fails, the same way she had on that first October morning, his hand on her face the same way too, and the 2 of them stood there in the snow without any particular agenda, not training, not performing, not achieving anything at all, just Fally. Some of the younger constables watched from a distance. They didn't say anything, in the way that young people sometimes recognize, without being able to articulate, are in the presence of something they'll still be trying to understand 20 years later, as you see it. Something about what it means to earn trust and then lose it and then find it again in a form you didn't expect. Fields. Something about how the things we carry longest are sometimes the things we thought we'd lost for good. Something about how the road home is occasionally a very long one, the fields, and runs through country you never expected, and sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you find what you were looking for waiting at the end of it, watching the gate.